Hello, Buckeye fans, and welcome to another episode of the Bucknuts Happy Hour. I am Patrick Murphy of Bucknuts and 24/7 Sports, joining you again this week as we talk some Buckeyes. We'll look ahead to this weekend's game against Minnesota. We will look back a little bit last week and the win against Michigan State, kind of what you should take away from a blowout win like that, and what kind of is real from that Buckeyes performance. We may talk a little Michigan. That seems to be a topic that comes up. And if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the comments. We'll answer as many as we can here at the end of the show. So feel free to get those in for us throughout. Let's kick it off, focusing on what's coming this week. Oh, and we've got our beer here. Today is a Coors Light day, keeping it simple. So cheers to that. But let's kick off talking about the Gophers here, and we bring in our friend Ryan Burns from Gopher Illustrated, our 24/7 Sports Minnesota site. Ryan, thanks for joining with us. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Like I told you in the pre-production meeting, I don't have a beer. I got some coffee here that I'm still trying to work through, but it's never a bad time for a beer because, like you always like to tell me, it's 5 o'clock somewhere.
Yeah, well, in your case, it's even an hour earlier, so it's a little extreme, unless you're having like a lunch beer, I guess. We're just crazy over here at Bucknuts. It's in the name, right? Bucknuts. So,
Exactly.
yeah. All right, so let's look at this Gophers team kind of from a big picture perspective first. For Ohio State fans who haven't paid a ton of attention, what were kind of your expectations coming into this year, and how have things kind of meshed with what you were hoping to see from this team?
Yeah, the Vegas preseason win total for this team was somewhere around 6.5 or 7, which is exactly what I predicted. I thought they were going to be 7-5 come the end of the season. It hasn't exactly gone the way I thought it was going to go because seemingly every single game has been dramatic one way or another, whether it's dramatically bad, dramatically good. You start off the season with the last second field goal against Nebraska on national television, and you get your first win of the season. And then you go to North Carolina, things don't click. You lose by 20 points. You come back home, or excuse me, you go on the road at Northwestern. You have a 21-point lead as I'm sitting there at Ryan Field with 13 minutes left in the game, and you find a way to blow it, and then you lose in overtime in dramatic fashion. Obviously, Michigan comes and goes. They do what they've done all year. You win in Iowa City for the first time since 1999. You then beat Michigan State by a couple of touchdowns. You have Illinois 2 weeks ago at 4th and 11. Their backup quarterback hasn't thrown a pass since September. Comes in 3 plays later, it's a touchdown. You lose in dramatic fashion. And then last week against Purdue, everything spontaneously combusted on defense. A lot of injuries at the linebacking core, and you give up over 600 total yards, over 300 on the ground. It's just seemingly there hasn't been a game where you really look at more or less this season, especially in conference play, where it's gone exactly like you thought it would. And I think that's part of the frustration for Gopher fans this season in year 7 with PJ Fleck. But it's just been such an up and down roller coaster season.
Sounds like it. I'd witnessed some of that watching from afar. Hadn't seen every game, but kind of looking back on it this week, it does seem like a roller coaster a bit. You mentioned PJ Fleck, and I asked you about this in our written back and forth that we did, but there was obviously some reporting before the season about some stuff surrounding him. Just, I don't know how much you want to get into kind of how that's played out, but what's kind of the vibe? You mentioned year 7, a guy who came in with a pretty high reputation at what he'd done at a lower level, but what's the perspective among Gopher fans of PJ Fleck and kind of where he's got this program right now?
Yeah, the hit piece, more or less, the way we've kind of viewed here in the Minnesota media, is that dropped right before Big Ten Media Days, alleging a toxic culture, alleging a lot of different things. And I think if you were to go back and ask that author, I think he would be rather looking at a different Big Ten West institution that actually did have a lot of things going on. And the thing with PJ, and it seemingly happens every year something like that comes out, is he's very polarizing because of his personality.
Yeah.
I mean, the way I like to characterize him, from having now 7 years of interactions with him with the camera on, the camera off, whatever it may be, he is who he is. It doesn't change when the lights come on, but he's not one Red Bull. He's 5 walking Red Bulls all the time. And you'll know within 15 seconds of meeting him whether that's the type of guy that you want to have a conversation with, that you want to have your son or daughter play for, or not. And if it's not, it's going to be, again, just like this season, you're either going to love him or you're going to hate him because of that personality. So it's been a lot of different things for him this season. And I know that, I mean, he's talked about it each and every week here with us in the media that they've yet to play a full game of complementary football on offense, defense, and special teams. We've seen games where the defense plays well, the offense doesn't. Offense and defense play well, the special teams spontaneously combust for the 7th straight year. I mean, it's just been very tough for this team to put it all together. And I think that ultimately, I mean, I forget who the coach was who ultimately said, you are what your record says you are. And that's what Minnesota is at 5-5. They've just been a big ball of inconsistency.
Which side of the ball would you say has been the most consistent then for the Gophers?
I would say the offense. I think if you look at their points per game and wins and losses, I think it's 22 points either way. That's where you look at the games where, I mean, that's what I'm going to remember about this season is why isn't Minnesota 7-3 right now with the loss to Northwestern, the loss to Illinois, and even last week to Purdue. I mean, they've scored, I believe, 26, 27, and 34 points in Big Ten West games and found a way to lose. Why? Because their defense has just not been consistent. And that's where offensively, I think they've been a lot better since the bye. And that correlates with their quarterback, Ethan Kaliakmanis, playing a little bit more consistent. I think he's had 3 touchdowns and back-to-back games here, no picks. I mean, he's been playing better, certainly. But it's first half versus second half, even offensively. Minnesota's been outstanding in the first half the last few weeks. And then they get to the second half, and you look at Ethan's completion percentage, and the passing game in general, it falls off a cliff. The execution falls off a cliff. So the defense has their own issues. The offense has their own issues. But I would say offense has been a little bit more consistent.
Reminder, if you tuned in late, we are talking with Ryan Burns of Gopher Illustrated, our 24/7 sports Minnesota site, about the Buckeyes' upcoming opponent this weekend. As I mentioned off the top, if you have questions, throw them in the chat. If you have questions for Ryan about Minnesota, throw them in the chat, and we'll try and get to some of those throughout the show. Ryan, talking about the offense, the run game seems to have been the strong point for Minnesota. It's clearly an emphasis for the Gophers. I know there's been injuries in that department. What can you tell us about kind of the health of that position group, and what Buckeye fans should expect to see on Saturday on the ground?
I mean, the last time Buckeye fans saw Minnesota, Mohamed Ibrahim was running circles around them and was on his way to a 200-yard game. And then he pops his Achilles in the late third quarter, and that game in Huntington Bank Stadium a couple years ago just flips on its head. It looks a lot different back there now with Mo Ibrahim no longer on the team. Let me run you through where Minnesota's at in the running back room. The starter they had in game 1, Sean Tyler from Western Michigan, he hasn't seen the field much. Why? Because he can't stop fumbling. And PJ Fleck's biggest motto or mantra within the program, the ball is the program. And if you continue to put it on the turf, and just 2 games ago, he took the opening kickoff and fumbled it. And then he never saw the field again. He can't stop fumbling. So he's no longer really part of the equation. Your running back 2 and Bryce Williams is out for the season with injury. Your running back 3, Darius Taylor, has played essentially 3 full healthy games. And when he has played in 60 minutes of games, he's been the Big Ten Freshman of the Week 3 different times. And that happened in 3 games. But he got injured on his 31st carry against Northwestern, returned after the bye week for Iowa, got re-injured, hasn't appeared since. So he's been out with injury. Your running back 4 is a freshman by the name of Zach Evans. He's been banged up, left in the second quarter last week, did not return. So now you're on a former walk-on and Jordan Newbin, who is Minnesota star safety, Tyler Newbin's younger brother. And it's a great story, but the reality is Minnesota's a much better football team when Darius Taylor is on the field, because what Fleck wants to do offensively is hold time of possession, run the football. And there have been some plays here the last couple of weeks where if you can just make one man miss, it's an explosive play. And again, Jordan Newbin has done a lot for this football team in the last few weeks, and it's a great story. But Minnesota needs to find health at that position if they want to be the offense that Fleck wants them to be. So it's been a struggle of late, I would say, in the running game.
We talked about the quarterback already. What does this passing game look like? Who are the names to know when the ball does go in the air for the Buckeyes to defend? And kind of how do you see that matching up against what has been a pretty good pass defense for Ohio State this year?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I was looking at the stats coming into the game, and I don't have to tell you or your listeners about how much of a change it's been, especially with explosive plays allowed. I think last year, Ohio State was 48th in the country in explosives of over 20 yards or more allowed. This year, I looked coming into the game today, they're fourth. So that's where Minnesota's been getting a lot better here of late. And if they are going to throw it, you're going to see a gigantic target share go to Daniel Jackson. Someone that is one of the best receivers to me in the Big Ten. He's certainly, I don't know if he's near the Marvin Harrison Jr. category, but he's a great contested catch winner. That's one of the things I love to look at with receivers. That's where Marvin Harrison has 10 contested catch wins. Daniel Jackson is right behind him, second in the Big Ten with 9. He's not the biggest guy in the world. He's not the fastest guy in the world, but he does an elite job of getting separation off the line. That is the first option in Minnesota's passing game quite a bit. You'll also see a lot of number 88 tight end, Brevin Spanford. Had a very disappointing start to his senior season, someone that was a preseason All-American. There was a lot of high expectations for him. It didn't go his way in the first half of the year. He's playing a lot better late. But if and when Minnesota throws 35-ish times in this game, you're going to see a lot to Daniel Jackson. You're going to see a lot to Brevin Spanford. And they'll also work in more ancillary pieces like Corey Crooms and Chris Hotman-Bell.
Spanford was somebody that Ryan Day brought up on his radio show specifically today. You mentioned it didn't go well at the start of the season. Why not? What was holding him back?
That's the question. I mean, we just talked to Brevin Spanford yesterday for the first time this year, and he talked about just a lot of ups and downs. He didn't come out and say it, but I wonder if the preseason expectations got to him a little bit, where he was trying to do too much and it led to some drops. I think I can think of 2 direct interceptions that hit him right in the hands, both hands deflected up into the air and became interceptions. So instead of an explosive play, a first down, potentially a touchdown, it's an interception instead. And so I just think expectations maybe got to him a little bit. He's simplified things. He's done a lot of different things, I would say, since that tumultuous start that he talked about. But I just think it comes back to playing within yourself with him, because he is one of the most physically gifted tight ends out there. He's 6'6", 265 pounds. I mean, last year caught 42 balls, was the most a Minnesota tight end had caught since 2006 when Matt Spaeth did it. I mean, he's a talented player. It's just him regaining his confidence. And I think he just went through a bad spout of poor play, which led to poor confidence. And they've really built him up here in the last couple of weeks, where he's gotten multiple touchdowns, or he's scored touchdowns in each of his last 2 games.
When you look at the defensive side of the ball and you look at Ohio State's offense, where can the Gophers maybe get after the Buckeyes in your mind?
If Minnesota is going to have a shot in this game, it's going to be because their defensive line comes to play. Because coming into that Purdue game, Minnesota's defensive line had really turned it up a notch. Physicality, athleticism, getting after the passer. Coming into that Purdue game, and their 3 games since the bye week, they had forced 8 turnovers in those 3 games. Now, last week, they couldn't get a stop, couldn't get off the field, didn't force a single turnover. But when it's going well, and when it has gone well here recently, it's Minnesota stops the run, and they got some pass rushers who can get after it. Guys like Ja Joyner, Anthony Smith, Jalen Logan Redding, Danny Strigow. I mean, they have been very physical up front, and I think there's been a big challenge this week. And that's where, talking with the defensive coordinator, Joe Rossi, yesterday, he called the defensive line's performance a disappointment. And I think they've challenged them quite a bit this week, because I think, like I do, I mean, Ohio State's incredibly gifted at the skill positions, but if there's going to be one place that you can attack them, it's potentially up front. And so Minnesota's going to have to get a pass rush if they're going to have a shot in this game.
Kyle McCord is a guy who's been polarizing in a different way than maybe some of the recent Ohio State quarterbacks, at least among the Ohio State fan base. What is the view maybe from people you talk to at Minnesota, from what you've seen of him? He has been good. He hasn't been CJ Stroud, Justin Fields good. So how does Minnesota kind of feel about that coming into this game, going against a Ohio State quarterback who probably isn't going to be a Heisman Trophy contender?
It's crazy to me to hear you as someone who covers this program. I mean, the bar for Ohio State quarterback play is just so exponentially high.
Yeah.
Where you mentioned Justin Fields, first round draft pick, Heisman Trophy caliber guy. CJ Stroud, Heisman caliber guy. He's the NFL Rookie of the Year front runner for what he's doing right now. And then you have Kyle McCord, who's sitting here probably thinking, I got 20 touchdowns, 4 picks, and everybody's trying to talk down on me. I mean, last week, like I do, 77% of his passes completed, 300 plus yards, 3 scores. I mean, you tell me, it looked like, to me anyway, potentially his best game of the season thus far, which obviously bodes well for them coming into the game this weekend. And then I hear there's a big game coming up next weekend for the Buckeyes too. So I think the way Minnesota views it is he's probably better than what many fans think, or at least Ohio State fans think. But he's obviously got great pieces around him that allow him to flourish, I would say.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting. There's been a lot of Kyle McCord talk this season. And I do think there's, as It's Justin Time says, we're a bit spoiled. He's talking about his Buckeye fans because it has been 3 straight guys who first-year starting quarterbacks have been Heisman Trophy finalists.
Let me give you some perspective here. Minnesota hasn't had a quarterback drafted in, I believe, over 50 years. And I know many Gopher fans, if there's any listening to this, would tell you they would kill for someone like Kyle McCord and the bevy of talent that Ohio State continues to have year after year. And so, yeah, I mean, to me, perspective is always needed. Yeah. But I mean, many teams in this conference, like I do, would kill for a guy like Kyle McCord.
Yeah, absolutely. I made a comparison on Twitter last week about J.J. McCarthy and Kyle McCord's numbers, and Michigan fans did not like that, but it's just interesting. Yeah, right. It's interesting, the different perspective, as you said, how J.J. McCarthy's being looked at, Kyle McCord's being viewed, yet their numbers are fairly similar, at least in terms of passing this year. Anyway, we don't need to go down that road quite yet. How are people in Minnesota feeling about this game? You mentioned if Minnesota is going to have any chance in this game, what's kind of the perspective among the fan base as the team heads to Columbus here?
I mean, there is no expectations, truthfully, for them to be even close in this game. I mean, I run a 24/7 site like you run a 24/7 site, and you feel like you got a pretty good pulse on what the fans think, hardcores and casuals.
Yeah.
And it's a 4-touchdown spread. Minnesota arguably just played their worst game defensively in many years. And now you get to go against Marvin Harrison Jr., Cade Stover, Kyle McCord, Travion Henderson, Emeka Ibuka, and you can't stop allowing explosive plays. Like in the 3 losses that have been egregious here in Big Ten play, the Illinois, the Purdue, and the Northwestern game, they've given up, I believe, 17 different plays of over 20 or more yards. Great. Now you get to go against Marvin Harrison and this entire gambit of silly talented players. And so that's what the expectations are. If they could keep it close, silver linings are dumb, especially in year 7 of a program. But if you can just keep it close, say Ohio State's looking forward to the Michigan game because they saw last week's game like I did, where Minnesota's really banged up at linebacker and they're playing a lot of freshmen back there. And so if you can just do some misdirection, some get their eyes going one way so they take the cheese and come back the other way, you've got the gifted enough athletes to where you're going to score touchdowns. So if Minnesota's going to keep it close in this game, they're going to have to generate turnovers. They're going to have to not allow Ohio State to score more than 20, maybe 24 points in this game, because you know how good that Ohio State defense has been. I have a lot of respect for what Jim Knowles has done here in year 2. And I mean, Minnesota's offensive yesterday compared the Michigan, Iowa, and Ohio State defensive lines. And that's where what he said about Ohio State's was they may not be able to run through you, but my goodness, are they the most twitched up of the 3. And they're one of the best defenses in college football because of it. And so it comes down to turnovers, explosive plays like it always does. But if Minnesota's going to have a chance, they got to keep this Ohio State offense out of the end zone.
If you were going to name like an X factor for Minnesota, maybe one on either side of the ball if you want, who would that be that could potentially help turn this game if it is to go in the Gophers' favor?
I would say offensively, it's got to be the quarterback, Ethan Kaliakmanis. I mean, he has just been so hot and cold from series to series, play to play, quarter to quarter, half to half. If good Ethan shows up for 60 minutes in this game, he is talented enough of a passer to keep Minnesota in this. If Anssi Athan shows up, which he has showed up in every single game this year, there's going to be multiple turnovers, just like in the Michigan game. There could be some pick sixes. It all comes down to the quarterback to me. And if he's kept clean, he's been a lot better, just like any college quarterback. But if he's on, this thing could get interesting. And then defensively, I mean, it comes down to me. I won't say a specific player because I just want to name the linebackers.
Okay.
The linebackers last week were the primary reason to me why Minnesota gave up 600 plus yards, 49 points. I mean, they couldn't make a run fit. They couldn't get in coverage correctly. They were taking the cheese. And if Minnesota can just clean up some things there, they'll have a shot in this game. But if their linebackers aren't healthy, if they just continue to be picked on, I mean, to me, there's no disparity in this game. I think it's either going to be a close one or it's going to be a 25-point blowout like Vegas thinks it's going to be with that 28-point spread.
We had a question from one of our viewers of the live show here for you. Michael Hester asked, how does Minnesota think about the future Big Ten and the additions of 4 more teams, 3 of which have maintained a presence in the top 25? We've talked about this a little bit with some of our guests, but I'd like to get your perspective on the new Big 10, Big 16, whatever we're going to call it here in the future.
Yeah, I think the perspective for Minnesota would be they're obviously happy to be a part of it. But the question then becomes, I mean, I'm very curious just in the short term to see what 2024 looks like in the Big Ten, because you mentioned those 4 teams that are joining. Well, we're talking about a Washington team that's going to be without Michael Penix next year, and we'll see if their offensive coordinator is still there. We'll see, obviously, with Oregon and Bo Nix, what does that look like once they're gone? Caleb Williams will be gone from USC. UCLA might be firing their coach here in the next week. I think in the short term, I'm very curious to see what all those teams look like, because next year Minnesota plays USC at home. They have to travel to the Rose Bowl to play UCLA. But I think it comes down to how do they continue to get better in recruiting? When I would argue that of the 18 then Big Ten teams, if you were to draw a 500-mile radius circle from the Twin Cities compared to any of the other 17 different Big Ten schools, Minnesota's is the worst in terms of the amount of Power 5 football talent around them. Okay. And so that's a big challenge for this job. One that I don't think enough people probably talk about is that the talent here in the state of Minnesota, it isn't even on the same stratosphere for many of these Big Ten institutions. And so how does PJ Fleck or whoever the Gopher football coach is continue to overcome that, especially with maybe not the NIL that some of these programs have? I mean, it's something that there's a lot of different talking points, at least from that perspective in this market.
Yeah, that USC Minnesota game, battle of 2 teams that wear like the same jerseys, which is interesting. I didn't realize they played both USC and UCLA next year.
In back-to-back weeks. It's
wow.
Unfortunate. I know a lot of people in this market were hoping that USC would come here in November because contrary to popular belief, I stare outside right now and it is 67 degrees out in mid-November.
Yeah.
But I know come the Wisconsin game next weekend, I think we're supposed to have projected highs in the upper 20s. So it's very hot and cold here. It still does get hot, just like it is today. But yeah, October 5th, USC comes to town next year. And then October 12th, Minnesota has to head out to California.
Yeah, I have a good buddy from college who is from the Twin Cities. I can say I've experienced both sides of the weather, even in like a week-long trip there. I've experienced both sides all at once. So not that different from Columbus, just a little further north. Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate your time. I know it's a busy week. Are you making the trip to Columbus this weekend?
I am not. I've been to Columbus before. I think I was back there 2018. It was a night game. I remember that.
Yeah.
But I'm not making the trip, unfortunately, with a 28-point spread in the way I think Minnesota's injuries are going to play out. I don't think it was in the budget for this year.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, Buckeye fans, that gives you kind of a perspective on Ryan's view of the game. We've done some written work. Your story is already up on my answers to your questions. I will have mine up either later today or tomorrow morning, depending on how things play out on our site. I appreciate all your help this week, and thanks for giving some good insight on here, Ryan.
Enjoy that Coors Light, me boy.
I will. Appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
All right, see ya.
All right, that was Ryan Burns from our Minnesota site, Gophers Illustrated. Go and check some stuff out over there that they've done. They've done some real good stuff this week with different coaches and players talking about the Buckeyes and kind of what they expect from this game. Again, if you have questions that you'd like answered on the Buckeyes, college football in general, you can throw Michigan questions in there, even though I feel like we've said everything we can possibly say about what's gone on. But if you have any questions, throw them in the chat. I saw a few already in there. We'll touch on some of those at the end of the show, but we can never have too many questions to end the show. So feel free to throw them in there if you've got them. I want to look back at last week's game for the Buckeyes because Ohio State went in as a big favorite. They handled the business early, got starters out. Some guys didn't even play. Travion Henderson, Cade Stover, some other guys barely or didn't play at all in the second half. And it's not a good Michigan State team. We knew the Buckeyes were going to win handily in that game. It would have been a huge upset otherwise. So at this point in the season, everything's looking towards, maybe not the players and the coaching staff. They've got to focus on week to week, but we are all looking towards Michigan at the end of the year, a potential Big Ten championship game, a potential college football playoff, and like how ready is Ohio State for that? So what can you take from that game? Blowout. I know it's only 35 points, but it could have been way worse if the Buckeyes wanted it to be. What do you take from that? And I think defensively, you saw pretty much more of the same. I'll get to a couple things on defense in a minute, but offensively, this was the Ohio State offense I think people have been expecting to see all season. So, how real is this, right? Marvin Harrison Jr. is legitimate. He had 7 catches for 149 yards and 2 touchdowns. But, is Kyle McCord's 24 for 31, 335 yards, 3 touchdown day? Is that something closer to what we expect from Kyle McCord? So my thought is that this is the next step in Kyle's progression. Now, is he going to put up these numbers against Michigan in 2 weeks? You'd hope so. I don't know if the yardage is the same. It's probably not as high of a completion percentage. But I think he took some really positive steps in this game. And the offensive line, now again, Michigan State's defense, not great, but also not as bad as I think people think of it. They kind of are a middle of the road defense this year. It's not the Michigan State defense of the past, but it's also not one of the worst defenses Ohio State has faced this year. So I do think there's something to the defensive line giving Kyle almost entirely a clean pocket. There were a couple times where he was pressured, maybe 3. I can think of 2 just off the top of my head. And I thought he handled that pretty well. Didn't give up a sack, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, no sacks for Michigan State. So what from Kyle's game can you take? Well, I think the first thing is, and this is something Ryan Day's talked about, when he is able to get his feet set and have that strong base, I think he is one of the better throwers in the country. Where he will need to get better is throwing when it's not perfect. And we've seen him make some throws off his back foot a few times. You actually saw one in that game, that pass towards the end of kind of the starters playing when I think it was on that first drive of the second half when he threw to Marvin Harrison Jr. in the end zone and kind of threw off his back foot, underthrew Marvin, and it wasn't Marvin's fourth touchdown of the game. But if he can get his feet set and kind of get into that groove early, and I think that's important, I think Kyle can be, is he elite right now? No. But he can be good enough with everything around him. Now, some of that has to do with the play of the offensive line and giving Kyle a clean pocket and allowing him to have the time. He's not worried about things going on around him. And that will be more difficult against a team like Michigan. Any teams they face, if you face an Iowa in the Big Ten championship game, obviously Iowa's offense doesn't do much, but the defense will certainly cause some issues. And then whoever is potentially in the college football playoff. But if you can get Kyle with that strong foundation and he's not moving his feet, and I think he's gotten better with that throughout the year, some of the throws he made in that game were as good as it gets. I mean, the first touchdown to Marvin Harrison Jr., good route. Now he's on a freshman cornerback. You like that matchup. Kyle recognizes it, throws with anticipation, lofts it into the end zone, the touchdown to Cade Stover, the putting it only where Stover can catch it, kind of on the outside there. These are throws that Kyle hasn't always been making. And there were very few throws in that game where I was like, come on, Kyle, what are you doing? Which hasn't always happened this year. So look, I think this is a positive step in the right direction. And, if you want to say it was just Michigan State, I get that. But imagine if Kyle had looked like he did against Rutgers, against Michigan State. Rutgers, a better defense, and there was some inconsistencies there. I think you'd be pretty disappointed. I think this is a positive step. Now, what Kyle needs to do is go out this week against another Minnesota team that doesn't have kind of the same horses and have another game that looks a lot like this one. If you can complete 75-ish% of your passes, throw for over 300 yards again, get your guys in the end zone a few times, I think that you're going to feel pretty good about where McCord is. Also, offensive line has to give him time to throw again. I think you're going to feel pretty good about Kyle's chances going up to Michigan after back-to-back really solid performances. That needs to happen for Kyle. I also really liked that Ohio State showed some different things than just their normal offense. And I think some of this probably has to do with, okay, we've had this in the playbook. We've run things to set things up for plays like this. Let's put it on film, something Michigan has to worry about here in a couple weeks. The first one that comes to mind, obviously, is the Marvin Harrison Jr. rushing touchdown, the reverse. A pretty simple play, but they executed it really well, faked the counter, which has been one of, I think it was TreVeyon Henderson who was in the game, one of Ohio State's best run plays this year. The thing that really stood out to me on that play was G. Scott Jr. coming from the right side of the offensive line, coming in motion or coming to the left, like he's going to block for TreVeyon Henderson on the counter. And then right as Marvin Harrison gets that ball, and the timing on this was perfect, he turns and goes, follows, I think it was Josh Fryer out as a lead blocker there. And it was so well blocked. There was a receiver out there. I'm not sure, probably Julian Fleming, if I had to guess, but play like that, something we hadn't seen a ton of from Ohio State. We've seen these handoffs to Xavier Johnson and Emeka Egbuka, but this one was based on something else that was set up by Ohio State having success with that counter play, and now you build something else off of it. Another example, the two running backs, the split backs. It was, I think, almost always Xavier Johnson and Chip Tranum, and they've done this the last few weeks, but they did it the most against Michigan State. Handoff to Xavier Johnson, Chip Tranum as the lead blocker. Then they switched it up and had Xavier Johnson go first, fake the handoff to Trip Tranum. Oh, both guys are running routes because I think it was Marvin Harrison who was double covered down the field. You've got a wheel route from Xavier Johnson. Nice little throw, 31-yard gain. Another fun play from Ohio State. These are the type of things that I think you can take going forward. This is the type of thing that, yes, maybe a better defense recognizes that quicker or doesn't have to double Marv so they can cover Xavier Johnson better coming out of the backfield. And maybe it doesn't go for 31 yards. But I think these are plays that they haven't shown a ton of this season. The end around, again, same thing. You've set that up with what you've done elsewhere. Now, maybe if you try that against Michigan, maybe Michigan recognizes that you don't get a touchdown. But I think there's opportunities there. And it doesn't have to be these same plays, right? Brian Hartline and Ryan Day, both this week, talked about with the split backs that they have some other things off of it that they can do, stuff that they like to do out of it. I will be interested to see if TreVeyon Henderson is involved in more of that at some point when they have those two, maybe TreVeyon and Chip Tranum in there. And obviously TreVeyon can do some similar things to what Xavier Johnson can do in terms of catching the ball out of the backfield as well. So I think that stuff is real. The fact that we're seeing some more creativity from the Buckeyes here at the end of the season. And part of that has to do with having your pieces back, right? You can run that split back set when Emeka Egbuka is healthy, so you don't need Xavier Johnson in playing wide receiver, and TreVeyon Henderson's healthy, so Chip Tranum can be your other back. So it's, you've got your full complement of guys. You're okay running Marv when you've got the other wide receivers available, right? And not that you ever want to risk anything happening to him, but you feel more confident with those guys out there blocking and whatnot. So I think it all kind of goes hand in hand. And I think that that's something you can take away, is this coaching staff looking for more creative ways to move the ball than just hand off to Travion, hand off to Tranum, throw the ball to Marv, take a shot, those type of things. And then the other thing that I think is something that will continue and has been a staple really all season when he's been healthy is Cade Stover. And I don't know if we're talking about him enough, but Cade Stover this year, 34 catches, 508 yards, 4 touchdown receptions on the season. You compare that to what he did last year in fewer games, 36 catches, so 2 fewer, 406 yards, 102 more, and he had 5 touchdowns last year. Cade Stover's become one of the best tight ends in the country. Obviously was banged up, so he didn't play against Rutgers, but when he's healthy, and he was healthy again last week, 7 catches for 79 yards and that touchdown we talked about. That's a guy you don't have to do anything fancy with, though. I did like Kyle McCord kind of improvising under pressure, flipping the ball out to Cade, and I think it went for a first down. But Cade's a guy I think you're going to have to lean on, and a guy, I've said this a few times this season, that during the college football playoff semifinal, he leaves in the end of the first quarter, I think it was. That's a guy I think that the Buckeyes missed more than people realize. Yes, you lose Marv late in the game, but if you'd had Cade there, I think you probably feel more comfortable on that final drive getting down the field than basically just relying on Emeka and Xavier Johnson. So I think Cade Stover continues to be a real weapon for this offense. I think he's a guy that's going to have to step up in Ann Arbor in 2 weeks, and then any potential games in the postseason that the Buckeyes have. Flipping to the defensive side of the ball, the one area that I am concerned about for this Buckeye team is the rush defense. And Jim Knowles was asked about this 2 weeks ago after the Rutgers game. In that game, Rutgers rushed for 239 total yards. 159 of those yards came from their running back. Now, 49 of those came on a trick play. So, but that's still 119 yards you give up on the ground to a running back. They've had issues. Issues is a strong word. They've had, if there are issues, that's where it's been for Ohio State. You give up against Notre Dame, a 70-yard rusher in Audric Estime. Against Purdue, you give up an 100-yard rusher. Against Wisconsin, where the Buckeyes actually held the Badgers in check, I think Wisconsin had, only 94 rushing yards, but Brendan Allen, who granted one of the best running backs in the country, or at least in the Big Ten, had 50 yards before leaving the game right before halftime. So he's on pace for a 100-yard day there. I think the Buckeyes have handled the rushing attack pretty well, but if you compare where they are rush defense wise to kind of the rest of their defense, 22nd in the country, giving up 112.4 yards per game on the ground, whereas against the pass, they're number 2, giving up 149.8. Obviously, you give up more yards through the air. That to me is kind of the concern, and especially given what you have coming in 2 weeks against Michigan. This is a Wolverine team that has not run the ball as well as people expected this season. I think they're just outside the top 40 in rush offense, but it's starting to get going for the Wolverines. Blake Corum last week against Penn State, one of the best rush defenses in the country, 26 carries, 145 yards, 2 touchdowns. Donovan Edwards, 10 carries, 52 yards, a touchdown. That, to me, is where Michigan is going to try and attack the Buckeyes. And you certainly will not be able to be as one-dimensional as Michigan was against Penn State in that second half, where I think they didn't complete a pass. I think they did attempt one that was called pass interference. But I think they will have to throw against the Buckeyes, and J.J. McCarthy will have to show he has the arm to beat Ohio State, which was a key last year. And he was able to do that thanks to some issues on Ohio State's defense. But that is one of the things that worries me a little bit about this team, man. You look at Michigan State last week, Nate Carter, who is a good running back, not a great running back, but a good running back at this point in his career, running behind a pretty bad offensive line, 52 yards on 11 carries. Jaron Mangum is backup, who just recovered from an injury, 35 yards on 9 carries. So, like, nothing overly concerning there. I think both guys came out early in the fourth quarter. Obviously, you're throwing because you're down, but there were some plays that hit a little bit against this Ohio State defense on the ground. I'm looking at Carter's stats here. He had a handful of, 4, 5, 6, 7, nothing big. I think it was Mangum who ended up having a couple big runs against the Buckeyes. Looking through here, but you just worry a little bit as it's going to get tougher, right? That to me is like where teams can get the Buckeyes a little bit. This defense that's been so good. So that is one thing that, each week when they've given up some of these. Now, what I will say, and Jim Knowles talked about that this week, is they've adjusted really well to what the opposing offense has done. And I think that has been a pretty important thing for Jim Knowles' teams the entire time he's been at Ohio State. But yeah, if you're looking for something to be worried about going forward, and I know Buckeye fans love to be worried about what's going to happen against Michigan, that does concern me a little bit, is the fact that the Wolverines are heating up against the run, and it's been Ohio State's, I don't want to say weak spot because they've been good. Like I said, they're number 22 in the country. That's not bad, but it's been the way to attack the Buckeyes, and Michigan certainly knows how to do that. They've proven it against Ohio State the last couple years, and like I said, they're heating up. So those are the things I think maybe the takeaways from that Michigan State game. Everything else, is kind of gravy when you're playing a team that just isn't able to match up with you this late in the year. And Michigan State was not. Again, if you have some questions, I know we've had a few more thrown in this chat here. You're watching this live. Feel free to throw them in there. I'm going to start answering some of these that I've noticed here. We've got one from Jabari DJ Big Hoover, I think. Will we unleash the Thurminator this week? Julian Thurman, the freshman tight end from Georgia, or Jelani Thurman, excuse me. Last week, 2 catches, 18 yards. Came in late, was out there with freshman quarterback Lincoln Kienholz. I don't think you're going to see Thurman unleashed this season unless something crazy happens injury-wise. Look, a super talented, super physically, gifted kid, but a guy that probably is not ready to do all of the things that Ohio State asks of its tight ends right now. And that's specifically on the blocking side of things. You look at how long it's taken a guy like Cade Stover, guy like G. Scott, who was a converted wide receiver, to kind of come into their own at the position. It doesn't just happen overnight when you're Ohio State. I mean, Jelani Thurman last year was essentially just a big wide receiver in high school. He wasn't asked to do the inline blocking stuff. So he needs to learn and, be willing to do that type of thing. And I think he's making progress from what I've been told. And we've talked to Keenan Bailey and the little bits we've seen him, but that is really the issue. I don't think it's, if you asked him to go out there and run routes and catch passes, could he do it? Yes. But they ask a lot more of their tight ends. I think next year, especially if Cade Stover's gone, which we expect, we'll see what happens with kind of the depth pieces Ohio State has. G. Scott, I imagine, steps up, but, Joe Royer hasn't done much. Sam Hart, Bennett Christian, those guys, kind of where do they stand? If Jelani can show that he can handle the blocking responsibilities, it could be an opportunity for him next year for sure. Jabari also asked, will we see Devin Brown this week a lot more of the West Dakota Heisman? I mentioned Lincoln Kienholz already. I like that nickname. I would say you could possibly see Devin Brown. I think Ohio State is going to be cautious with him. I will say when we were setting up for interviews on the indoor field at Ohio or at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center Wednesday night, the quarterbacks come in from the practice field, and I don't know what they do down at the far end, but they end up like doing basically like 40-yard, 50-yard sprints towards us. And some of the younger guys went, and I was curious if Devin would run, given he's playing with an ankle, and he did, and it looked okay. Now it's still pretty heavily taped. So look, I think if it gets in I don't think what you'll see, because I don't think you'll need it if you're Ohio State, is Devin Brown in that red zone package. You shouldn't need that against Minnesota. You should be able to do kind of whatever you want in this game, I would imagine. But, if you get down to the point in the second half where you're pulling starters out, I think you could see Devin Brown. Now, it's definitely possible that Ohio State decides we're going to be cautious with him. We want him to be good for Michigan next week. We don't want anything to happen and him to tweak that ankle. So maybe they go with Lincoln again, let him get some more reps, which will be good for him down the line. But I also, it's never a bad idea to get reps for a guy like Devin Brown, who is only one play away from needing to come into a game and play meaningful snaps. And B, at some point, I mean, if you look at the pecking order right now, he's next in line whenever Kyle McCord heads off to what we assume will be the NFL. And I don't think that's coming after this year, but you look down the road, getting Devin reps is not a bad idea if he's healthy enough. And, that's kind of the big question, right? Is he healthy enough to come out there and do what they want to do? So I would be surprised if you see him in the red zone. I would not be surprised if he plays a little bit, but it could be more of, as Jabari puts it, the West Dakota Heisman, which I really like that nickname for him. Let's see. How will Michigan do at Maryland? Malachi Wilson asked that. I don't think that he also asked and lead to the Michigan coach being fired. If anyone gets fired at Michigan, I don't think it'll have to do with what happens at Maryland on Saturday. I imagine the Wolverines will be just fine at Maryland. Now, I will say, we all remember Ohio State. Apologies there. We all remember Ohio State going to Maryland the week before the Michigan game last year, and that game and kind of how it went. But this is a Maryland team that, since losing to Ohio State earlier this year, has lost to Illinois, Northwestern, Penn State 51-15, and then last week won at Nebraska by 3. So this isn't even the Maryland team that came into Ohio Stadium hot and undefeated and looking good. I mean, it's kind of all fallen apart as it has in the past for Maryland in the second half of this season. I mean, they've fallen to 6-4 overall after a 5-0 start, 3-4 in Big Ten play. So I watched Michigan last week. I think they look pretty focused on what's going on, just like Ohio State. I imagine they handle Maryland pretty comfortably. But like I said, Maryland put up a big fight against Ohio State last year. If Michigan's looking ahead a little bit, thinking, it's all already, Michigan last year against Illinois in that game before coming to Columbus, it was a dogfight. I think it went down to, late in the fourth quarter. Now, Michigan didn't play all their players in that game. Blake Corum, I don't think, really played. So, there was some of that there. But there is always that danger of looking ahead, and that's the case for both teams, this week as they get ready for the big game in 2 weeks in Ann Arbor. Michael also asked, do you feel the Big Ten will stand pat with their present discipline of Michigan, even if the NCAA's investigation includes a strong indication of validity to the charges brought forth? Right now, I don't think the Big Ten is going to do anything more than they have, and I think they'll let the investigation play out with the NCAA. I don't think it would make sense for the Big Ten to make a ruling on Jim Harbaugh and, say he's suspended through the rest of the season and then come back with more penalties unless more comes out. And obviously, though things have slowed down with the Michigan scandal, things things have continued to trickle out about this situation. So unless there's anything new that comes up, I think that you've probably seen what will happen to Michigan during the season. The NCAA will probably act at some point in the offseason. What that means, for Michigan is tough to say. I think that right now this is what the punishment's going to be. We will see what this hearing in Ann Arbor brings as they look to get Jim Harbaugh back on the sidelines. I'm no lawyer, so I don't know enough about that to comment, but it's not been a boring time to be in Ann Arbor right now, especially if you are interested in kind of the downfall of the Wolverines program. Stephen Conrad, I'm curious what the OSU defense will do against the team up north, having 7 offensive linemen on the field, or at least 3 tight end sets. He said he's doubtful a nickel won't lead to mismatches when they pull and trap. I think you will see more 3 linebacker looks against Michigan, assuming Tommy Eichenberg is healthy. Him, Steel Chambers, and Cody Simon on the field to match up with those type of bigger sets. I think if Lathan Ransom were healthy, and it doesn't sound like, unfortunately, he will be back for that game, I think you could see maybe Sonny Styles kind of play that linebacker spot and move in, kind of that bigger nickel to help defend against the run. But with him having to play the bandit safety with Lathan out, I do think you will see less of Jordan Hancock in those situations, and maybe none of Jordan Hancock in those situations, and maybe more Cody Simon, who continues to play pretty well. Michael Hester, do you think Minnesota rushing could be limited more if we went with 3 linebackers going off of what we just said? Yeah, I don't know if Ohio State will do a ton of that. I'm sure there will be 3 linebackers on the field, especially if Tommy's back this week when Minnesota goes into their heavier packages. But I do think you can stop some of Minnesota's rushing attack even with Ohio State's base defense. This isn't the Michigan rushing attack, right? This isn't the same level, though still been good this year. And if Darius Taylor is still out, which is the expectation, their freshman running back, Jordan Newman has 81 carries for 393 yards. Sean Tyler, 58 for 227. So it's not a rushing attack that's going to absolutely kill you. So I don't know if you go with that. You've shown it, so it's not like you're hiding anything from Michigan. Everyone knows that you have the ability to go with 3 linebackers. So maybe they do it if they need to. But I do think they've proven that they can also stop the run as much as they have out of their base defense. They did some of that against Wisconsin. I mean, they even went to a dime package at one point against Wisconsin when Wisconsin spread things out. Bill Mash, could we see Hayden as a surprise with Henderson? I think the Dallin Hayden situation is one of the stranger ones I've ever seen. I don't know why there's a hesitation to put the kid on the field. I think he's super talented. I get not wanting to unnecessarily burn a red shirt, but if Dallin Hayden next year is Ohio State's starting running back because Travion Henderson and Mayan Williams are gone and he has a great year, is he sticking around an extra year after that or an extra 2 years after that? I don't know if it makes sense to plan that way. So to answer your question, it would be a surprise. I think that's the way you phrase the question is very valid because I don't think that Ohio State plans on using Dallin Hayden except in an emergency capacity. Despite the fact that every time he gets out there, he does a good job running the ball. And, I do think it would be interesting. The one thing I don't know with those two together is what I think it does is it gives you 2 guys that are both very likely to get the ball. But I think when you have Chip out there, Chip is perfectly capable of being a lead blocker. And we've seen him line up at fullback this year. So, if you have Travion and if you have Hayden out there, who's blocking? I don't think you're going to have, while Travion has proven to be willing to stick his head in there and block for Kyle McCord, Dallin hasn't done that as well. I don't know if either of them is the guy you want as kind of the lead blocker in those situations. They both can do some different things, though. I think it would be interesting I'm not sure that you will see it, though. I think, as you said, it will be a pretty big surprise, just because of how little they've used Dallin Hayden this year and kind of the insistence to keep his redshirt year alive. Okay, we're going to wrap it up with our usual final segment, the what you will be reading on Sunday, what the headline will be on, well, Saturday night, Sunday morning, whenever you are going to tune in for your Buckeye news. I'm going to keep it simple like last week. I think this will be a very similar game to the Michigan State game. Minnesota, just a banged up team, not a ton to play for. As Ryan brought up when he was on talking with us, there's not a ton of expectation here. Now that's outside the program. Obviously, those guys are going to come in and fight, but I think it's a lot like Michigan State. Maybe the score maybe it doesn't come quite as easy, but I think the final score could be similar. So I think the headline will be, Buckeyes handle Gophers, prepare for matchup with unbeaten Wolverines with everything on the line. And look, I can't tell you how excited I am for next week. I'm sure you guys all are too. This is, the game that everybody has circled. It was awesome going to Notre Dame and kind of seeing that atmosphere in that game. The Penn State game was huge in Columbus. You can, name the teams that Ohio State has played over the years and the opportunity to watch those games, cover those games, all that. But this is the game that matters, right? And I think even before all of the Michigan scandal stuff, this game had so much, especially from an Ohio State perspective, after losing these last 2 years. It was going to be tremendous. And then you add in Michigan in trouble, stuff that's been said about Ryan Day and this program by people on that side of things. And I think you've only thrown fuel on the fire here. I think it's going to be awesome, Ann Arbor. I can't wait to get ahead and, kind of see that game and kind of the build up next week. It's always fun. You throw Thanksgiving in there with the turkey. It's a great week. It's a great week. I'm very excited for it. I'm sure all of you guys are as well. But before we do that, we've got Minnesota this week. We will be there. We will be covering the game, so stay tuned for all that. Still got plenty of stuff to come out this week with our Michigan Minnesota. Wow, I'm already ahead of myself with our Minnesota coverage. And then after the game, Dave will start the What We Learned Live as soon as the whistle blows. Steve and I will make our appearances on there, talking about the game, the post-game press conference, all that. And then it's on to Michigan. So it's crazy. It's crazy we're already this far into the season. Thank you all for tuning in. I do appreciate it. Thanks to Ryan Burns from our Minnesota site at 24/7 Sports. If you missed any of Ryan, go back and watch this. The podcast version of this will be up here in a little bit, but you can find the full archive video version on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll talk next week. Next week we will probably do this show earlier in the week, given the holiday. I'm hoping to get a couple of special guests on. Trying to work out schedule things with them. We may even do 2 versions of the show, one with the guests and then one where we talk with our Michigan guys. So we'll see, but we'll let you guys know. So stay tuned for that. Cheers, everybody. We'll talk to you on Saturday.